Hello out there, friends, family, enemies, and strangers of all kinds. Welcome back to the Extra Milestone, your weekly Cinemaholics spinoff, where we take a trip into the past to discover the classic films that have made the cinematic landscape what it is today. I am your host, as always, Sam Noland, a staff writer for Cinemaholics. And with me, I have, for the very first time, not only on Cinemaholics, not only on the Extra Milestone, but on the art form of podcasts as a whole, I have my good friend of a very long time now, Andrew McMahon. I hope I pronounced that right. Andrew, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Sam, for having me. And yes, you did pronounce my name right.
Oh, thank goodness. Yes, I remember you telling me that you get some weird pronunciations of your last name. So I'm, as someone who gets a slightly mispronounced name all my life, really, I can sympathize with that. So I'm glad to have gotten it right the first time.
Yeah.
But yes, Andrew, this is the Extra Milestone. How does it feel to be on this show that I'm sure you've listened to every episode of?
Well, I haven't listened to every episode.
Shame.
I've listened to a couple, just because I haven't seen nearly as many movies as you have. So
that's a bit of hyperbole, but the quantity wise, yes. But your knowledge is exceeded by very few that I know, and I do not say that lightly. You're one of my favorite reviewers to read on Letterboxd, and the times that I've met you in person have been an absolute delight. And so I'm glad to welcome your knowledge, your wisdom, and your cinematic enthusiasm onto the Extra Milestone at last. Andrew, for the listeners who don't know you, which is most likely all of them, pretty much.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. What is it that makes Andrew McMahon the cinematic savant that he is?
Well, for me, I've always enjoyed movies since I was a young kid. Back then, I obviously used to watch them mostly just as entertainment. But by the time I got into the end of my high school years and beginning of my college years, I watched a movie called Drive by Nicholas Winding Refn, which kind of turned out to be my quote-unquote gateway drug into cinephilia, you could say.
Fascinating.
And then when I started college, I was just an undeclared liberal arts major. So I took a class on exploitation and cult films my second semester of my first year. And I was kind of hooked from there because in that class we watched stuff like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Freaks from 1932, some other obscurities like Rock and Roll High School, and some sleazier things. So I kind of fell in love right from then and there.
Okay, we have to tell the listeners about Rock and Roll High School. We're off on a tangent already. Rock and Roll High School from 1979 is a movie about it, and if I might be remembering this slightly wrong, but it's about a high school that somehow gets involved with the Ramones, the band.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And they just sort of show up and sing songs, and they wrote some original songs for it, right?
Yeah, and it's got PJ Souls, who you might know from Halloween.
Oh yes! Oh my gosh, that cult class sounds fantastic. I wish I had been able to track down that course. Did you ever watch like Maniac or something? Because that seems like the kind of thing that would have been taught in that class.
Yeah, we didn't watch Maniac, unfortunately. But if I myself were ever to teach a class on that, yeah, I think I'd maybe consider putting Maniac on the syllabus, because
that would be on the curriculum. Yeah, Maniac is
that's
fantastic.
just like an all-time trash movie for me.
I've brought up Maniac before on the show when I was talking to Jason Reed about Eyes Without a Face, and don't be surprised if I bring it up again over the course of our conversation today, because a certain movie that we're going to talk about reminded me of Maniac, which brings me to what's on the quote-unquote syllabus for today. So lovely transition there. As announced in the show notes of the episode last week, we got a double header, and kind of a weird one at that. We are going to talk about first off, Michelangelo Antonioni's The Passenger from 1975, 45 years old. It's been a hell of a 4.5 decades, if I do say so myself. And then after that, we are going to round out the show with our B feature, Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, one of the most influential and fascinating horror movies, and arguably just movies in general of all time. I'm very excited. Andrew, what say we get right into the magic?
Yes, let's do it.
I love it. All right. So, as I announced literally less than 30 seconds ago, we are going to begin with our discussion of Michelangelo Antonioni's The Passenger.
Michelangelo Antonioni, one of the great film artists of this generation, now takes you on a fascinating and spellbinding journey into identity. Jack Nicholson is the reporter, famous, powerful, respected, and a haunted, driven, desperate man. Maria Schneider, the sensual young star of Last Tango in Paris, is the girl who ran with him and for him.
What are you running away from?
The passenger, a man who's just found a way out. He's changed places with a dead man.
We are sure of the doctor's report. Your husband died from a heart attack.
And he is about to begin an odyssey that will take him into that man's life and fate.
Robertson is involved in illegal arms traffic in our country.
I just sold 5,000 hand grenades, 900 rifles, and a great deal of ammunition to some people fighting a secret war in an obscure part of the world.
A world that will never look the same again.
Let's go.
All right!
The brilliance of Jack Nicholson. The beauty of Maria Schneider. The vision of Antonioni.
To begin with, I think it's important, A, to establish who Michelangelo Antonioni is, and also to establish sort of our base of knowledge with this director, because I think he's certainly an auteur, and I think The Passenger specifically falls in a succession of movies that is very interesting to trace sort of the trajectory of. So Michelangelo Antonioni, as you may guess from the last name, is an Italian director who was sort of groomed on the Italian New Wave of the 1940s and 50s, and actually got his start within that wave, directing a few shorts, a feature or two, and then started gaining a little momentum in the mid-1950s with a movie called Les Amis, aka The Girlfriends, which I watched yesterday and was fascinated to find that I wasn't that interested by it. Have you seen Les Amis, Andrew?
I have not. I have not seen any of his movies prior to La Ventura, which I think is kind of considered his breakthrough movie, as far as I can tell. Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. That was his first international success, a movie called La Ventura, aka The Adventure. And I think it's at this point when you realize, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but Antonioni gets significantly more interesting as a filmmaker and storyteller as the movies progress. Would you say that there's some truth in that?
Yeah, I think there is some truth in that. It's interesting because he obviously started off making movies in Italy, and then he obviously did La Ventura, La Notte, and La Eclipse, which
Yes.
make up the I think the trilogy of Alienation, is it, or Modernism?
Modern Alienation, maybe it's something along those lines. And yeah, is that not the most European sounding trilogy of like you've ever heard of? Yeah, that's exactly it. It's a trilogy of movies that, from what I understand, I actually haven't seen the second two, are not connected by plot. It's more of like a thematic thing about sort of struggling and making, like, just trying to make sense of the modern world as it was emerging in the early 1960s. And yeah, I watched La Ventura 2-ish years ago, and I gotta say,
same here.
It's a pretty movie. It's a visually exciting movie. I could not tell you much else beside that.
Yeah, I couldn't either at this current point. It's definitely one I need to rewatch, because that was, I think, the second Antonioni movie I watched. First, I started with Blow Up, which I wasn't too impressed with initially, and I wasn't very impressed with La Ventura either when I first watched it. But then at the beginning of this year, I watched Zabriskie Point, which really made me think of Antonioni in a different way than I had in the past, and made me see a new side of it.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you say that. It was I had heard of the movie Zabriskie Point at the beginning of this year, and it wasn't until I saw actually your review of it that I was like, oh, I got to keep an eye out for this thing. And because it came out in the year 1970, of course, it came up when I was collecting titles eligible for the Extra Milestone. And so eventually when the time came and the anniversary was coming up, I was like, why not? I'll give it a watch. And I was really quite impressed by it. Now, to give a little context for how that movie and what we are ultimately going to talk about came about, there was one other movie in between that, amazingly artistic trilogy, and the sort of the trilogy of American movies that Antonioni made, which was Red Desert, which I actually watched this morning. That has been on my watch list for a very long time. And that some consider it to be like the fourth in that Alienation trilogy, because it deals with many of the same themes from what I understand. And I got to tell you, is it kind of like a
bridge between those two different 3-movie runs he had?
You know, it actually kind of is. From having not really been super fascinated with La Ventura, given all the praise I'd heard given to it over the years from various places, I went into Red Desert not really knowing what to expect, and I really kind of loved that one. And it's kind of hard to figure out why. It's not stylistically very different from La Ventura, even though it is in color, which I think is especially noticeable considering that it's got an incredibly drab color palette. Something about that idea of alienation and just not being able to find a place in the world to save your life came across so much better in that movie for whatever reason, because it's all about the way that industrialization is just sort of encroaching and, dare I even say, like perverting the natural world. And it sort of reminded me of a movie that came out 8 years later, which is Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris. And if we haven't alienated almost every listener by now, this is going to be the thing that does it. Because that is a movie that, the way I've always read it, is that it's all about sort of the way that this planet, Earth, that we live on, has so much to offer. And yet, for so long, we've been just not we specifically, but just as a species, we've been so obsessed with sort of altering it and shifting it, and even in as recent as the last century, as leaving it, abandoning it. And I think that's a movie all about the existential dread that can be found in space. And as I was watching Red Desert, I was definitely thinking, yeah, Tarkovsky must have loved this movie. Maybe that's why I really loved it. Nice. But either way, I was a really big fan of Red Desert. So I think that that's not a bad place to go if you're unsure, if you're sort of unsure on whether or not Antonioni is your jam in the way that he sort of came to be, if you know what I'm saying. And then after that came a trio of American, or at the very least English language produced films. Now this started with Blow Up, which you mentioned before. Now you mentioned you weren't a fan of Blow Up when you first saw it. So I take it to mean that you've changed your tune on it somewhat. Is that true?
Yeah, the second viewing I had of it was kind of revelatory for me. The same way that Zabriskie Point was. I was able to kind of just vibe with it a lot more, knowing the conclusion beforehand and not really being frustrated by the elusiveness of the central mystery that he sets up.
Yeah. It's one of the weirdest plotted movies I've ever seen in my life. I also watched this one this morning. I have never seen anything like it. It's a sort of a murder mystery, but it does not play out like any murder mystery you've ever seen. By which I mean to say, it doesn't get to the murder until the movie's halfway over. A lot of it is just this character, this photographer played by David Hemmings, just sort of going about his day, frankly, being kind of a dickhead. I wasn't a huge fan of this character, but it's just you see like what this guy does from on a normal day, living in this like lavish studios and going into antique stores and buying giant plane propellers for no particular reason whatsoever. Like that's a plot point that never really amounts to anything. He just feels like buying a propeller because it looked nice. Why not?
Yeah.
That's the kind of lifestyle he leads. And then just so happens to while taking some photographs of these two lovers in this like this grassy glade or something, realizes that he may have photographed a murder. Now, if that plot sounds familiar, it was remade by Brian De Palma as the movie Blowout, which is one of the great thrillers. Have you seen Blowout?
Yeah, Blowout's one of my all-time favorites. It could enter my top 10 at any moment, honestly.
It's really fantastic. Yeah. I will say I think Blowout is better than Blow Up, but Blow Up was just really fascinating to watch. Yeah, no, it's by quite a bit, I might say. Because Blow Up, as weird as it is, that kind of works against it in some ways, but it makes for a memorable movie, that's for damn sure. And so it must have been just this huge left turn from Red Desert, because it's not like there's nothing really intensely existential about Blow Up, although it does glance in that direction a couple times. So that was interesting to see. And then after that came the movie that we mentioned a couple of times, Zabriskie Point, which is fantastic. I finally watched it, and yeah, you were absolutely right. It's really something special. It's really like it quickly became one of the defining movies of like the 70s counterculture in my mind. One of three to come out in the year 1970 alone, which I think is very, very interesting that so much of the decade was defined by these early movies that were still coming off of the 60s. There was Zabriskie Point, there was Five Easy Pieces, also with Jack Nicholson, coincidentally enough.
Right.
And there's Barbara Loden's Wanda, which I know we're both amazing. Huge fans of. Yeah. That's coming up later this year for Extra Milestone. So I cannot wait to talk about that.
Awesome.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. And yeah, so it's this huge, just kind of epic feeling, really. Just this angry, or not even really angry, but just sort of not really having the world kind of movie. For the basic premise is that a student just gets bored one day and hijacks a plane and flies to the desert, and eventually a building blows up. That's it. It doesn't get a lot more counterculture than that. And fun fact, it's the same house where the bulk of the action in Orson Welles' The Other Side of the Wind takes place. So that's a fun little connection there.
Another movie that you should definitely watch if you haven't.
I only just got to that recently, and I'm ashamed of it because that thing is utterly fascinating. So yeah, a lot of good stuff to be found in this time and this place in cinema history.
Absolutely.
But yeah, reading up on it, I found out that Zabriskie Point, while at the time was not the biggest critical hit, nor was it the biggest financial hit. So it was a little bit of a stumbling point for Antonioni. So that's part of the reason why it took half a decade for his next movie to come out, which is, finally, we're getting to it, The Passenger, released in 1975. Another American movie, another very sort of loosely structured, although there is a rather discernible plot to be found within it. But just sort of... just this movie about really crumbling under the weight of 1970s ennui. Like, do you think that's a fair assessment to make?
Yeah, there's definitely, I'd say in all of his movies, ennui plays a big part. And in this one particularly, I think it's kind of about feeling dissatisfied with your occupation and not being able to balance that with like your personal life.
Yeah, that's a great assessment. I can't wait to get more into it. Just a little background, just to set the stage a little bit for what the deal is with The Passenger, as Jerry Seinfeld would say. It was produced in 1973 to 1974, starring Jack Nicholson, who replaced the initial choice. I don't know if you know this, which was Donald Sutherland. And I'm imagining Donald Sutherland in this role.
Wow.
It's a really different movie because Donald Sutherland is so much more stoic than Jack Nicholson. I don't think he would have been able to get sort of the what I'm going to jump ahead and call what I perceive to be kind of the pathetic nature of this lead character that we see Jack Nicholson ultimately fulfill. Did you know that Donald Sutherland was originally cast in the lead?
I did not know that. That surprises me quite a bit because, yeah, he does not seem like the natural choice you would want to have for this type of character. I think Jack Nicholson fits that mold a lot better than Donald Sutherland would have. So probably a good thing that didn't come to pass.
Although if it had come to pass, there is a good chance that the movie might be more acclaimed today, because this was fascinating to me for whatever reason, because I think it was the studio or maybe some studio head specifically or something. They owed Jack Nicholson one, essentially, for some sort of project that had fallen through. So they just gave him the video rights for whatever reason. And being Jack Nicholson, he decided to hoard them for 30 years. It wasn't until like the mid 2000s that this got a really substantial release and a real push in the theatrical and home video market. So it's so weird to hear about movies like that. Like you hear about Army of Shadows and how that was practically non-existent here in the US for the better part of half a decade. Or half a century.
Half a century, yeah.
So strange to think about that. I'm like, Jack Nicholson, this is great. Why would you keep it from us? There's no reason to do that. Oh wait, you're Jack Nicholson. I can maybe I should have thought twice before inquiring as to the ways of Jack.
Maybe he just loved it so much he just felt like he had to keep it to himself.
Like, I gotta keep this sacred so the world doesn't waste it, or something like that. That's my pathetic Jack Nicholson attempt. That's what I've tried to do so many times over the years. I can get it every once in a while. As it turns out, today is not one of those days. Alas, I push it.
Still a good attempt.
Thank you. Yes, I've got hundreds of others, so I think not being able to do one impression is probably not the end of the world. Yes, and co-starring with Jack Nicholson is Maria Schneider, who had just a year or two before been in Last Tango in Paris with Marlon Brando. And it turns out this was sort of a spot of contention between her and Antonioni, which was that she was supposed to appear in sort of a raunchy sex scene along the course of the movie, and she had been kind of traumatized by a similar experience on the set of Last Tango in Paris. So at her insistence, actually, it was toned way down to the point where you watch it.
It's basically non-existent.
Basically non-existent. There's like one shot, and it's at a distance where there's some flesh and that's all we get. So,
yeah,
I think
that's really interesting,
I think
though.
Yeah, so good for her for standing up for herself. And she did not have the easiest personal or professional life. So I'm glad that she at least got this, if that's any respite or consolation. The movie competed at Cannes for the Palme d'Or, lost to a movie I've never heard of, Chronicle of the Years of Fire from Algeria. Have you ever heard of that movie, Andrew?
I have not, but it sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like you go way back to like the earliest Academy Awards, and you see these all-time classic movies that we still like watch and revere today, and they lost to like what? It lost to How Green Was My Valley? What even is that? So it's definitely one of those things where evidently they did not have foresight in that way, but there's only so much you can do. And yeah, it was really sort of getting to the movie itself. The Passenger is really sort of this culmination, I feel. And again, there are like spots of Antonioni's filmography that I missed, especially a lot of the earlier stuff and some of the stuff in the middle. But from what I've seen, which is not insubstantial, this is kind of a real intense culmination of kind of a lot of the things that he had touched on before. And so I think unless you had any other,
I got to.
Yeah, I think it's a real sort of, I wouldn't call it the best. I think Zabriskie Point edges it out slightly, but I would say it's about on par with Red Desert. This is real cream of the crop as far as I'm concerned with what I've seen with Antonioni's filmography.
Yeah, and I would say it's probably his most personal movie too.
Interesting.
From what I've seen.
I'm excited to hear about. I'm excited to hear about that. So yeah, let's lay out a little bit of the plot. So the movie starts. It's Jack Nicholson who plays this intensely disgruntled reporter, even more so than you would assume Jack Nicholson playing a reporter would be. Like the first thing we see him doing is just sort of wandering throughout the deserts of Chad, the nation of Chad in Africa, which was in the midst of a civil war at the time. And we find out is trying to track down these rebels, which he's trying to interview for like a TV movie in England, and is just like doesn't speak the language and has no idea where he is. And at this point, and I've actually just to clarify, I watched this movie like 2 or so months ago because it happened to be expiring from the Criterion channel. I was like, I'll finally give this a watch. So I actually have seen this twice within a very short span, which was interesting because the first time I do not remember being as struck by how kind of unusually funny this movie is. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah.
That there's like this weird, almost, I hesitate to say screwball comedy, but just the humiliation that Jack Nicholson goes through all throughout this movie was kind of a delight to see in a way that I was not expecting. Like for whatever reason, it just did not come across the first time. And so just right off the bat, seeing Jack Nicholson just sort of like, where the hell am I? Just going throughout the desert, getting stuck in the sand in a Land Rover and like whacking the car with a shovel. There was something about it that just struck me as kind of funny and not in an empathetic way. Like I think we're supposed to be laughing at this character because he's clearly just sort of out of his depth, just doesn't really want to be there. Like you could tell that within minutes. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. It's often said that Antonioni's a pretty humorless guy, but I think parts of this movie would at least prove that he does have a sense of humor.
And that is not consistent with any of the other movies I've seen. So I wonder if it was just Jack Nicholson specifically, maybe just because of this, huge connection that a lot of people now have with him in the years since, and even before The Passenger, the legacy that Jack Nicholson has built up. So just seeing him in this role was enjoyable inherently. So that may have just added to it. But regardless, eventually finds his way to this hotel. And it's at this point we see that Jack Nicholson in this movie plays a reporter named David Locke not the most empathetic guy, not the nicest guy, not the most reverent for the place he's in. Like, he goes into this hotel and just downright orders the workers there to like bring him water. No please, no thank you, no anything, and even kind of scoffs at them.
And then he takes a shower, and then he's like all disappointed because there's no soap.
Yeah, and just gives this just this Jack Nicholson face of why I oughta or something, and it's like, no, you don't oughta, Jack Nicholson. It's fine. There's no reason to be so bad. But Jack Nicholson goes back to this hotel, which, as it turns out, he had been there some days before and had struck up a sort of a brief friendship with this self-referred businessman named David Robertson, I believe. And they had sort of talked. We find out in this flashback that we see Jack Nicholson is in a much more chipper mood than we see him at the beginning of this movie. So clearly there's been a bit of a downfall, you know? So I think it's masterful. But the way they set up that flashback, and this is where the movie really gets started, is that Jack Nicholson goes to see, is my friend Robertson still here, goes into his room, and he's lying dead, face down on the bed. Yeah. And so what a thing to come across just after trudging through the desert is like, and now there's a corpse in the room next to me. Great. And so Jack Nicholson, in what I can only imagine is just this impassioned impulse driven by humiliated rage, decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to swap identities with this dead guy. And so
because they both look the passenger. Similar.
They look kind of similar, but I find that even funnier in and of itself, because he like takes a razor blade, switches the photos in the passport, which are apparently just pasted in there. I think they've upgraded since then, but regardless, is able to pull it off. Goes up to the front desk and says, "Hey, my friend David Locke, in air quotes, actually me, is dead." And they're like, "Oh, damn. Okay." Like, no questions asked.
Well, let's check our booking.
Yeah. My apologies, Mr. Robertson. And so has successfully pulled off this hoodwink that would be just impossible today. So on top of that, it's already funny watching it now, just how easy it is to give up your identity, at least at first. The movie sort of spirals into other places later on. But this initial bit of trickery is just almost comically easy to pull off. And then the other thing that I find so hilarious is that it's a movie about Jack Nicholson pretending to be someone else. Now, I know they look kind of similar, but Jack Nicholson at this point is one of the most recognizable rising stars in all of Hollywood. He had already done Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces, The King of Martin Gardens, The Last Detail, and Chinatown, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out later this year.
In the same year.
He's a huge star. So just the idea of Jack Nicholson impersonating someone else with no real thought to like altering his cadence or his appearance in any way whatsoever, that's even funnier to see, especially just given the persona of Jack Nicholson. There's no other human being on earth like Jack Nicholson. So that is funny to me.
And just the fact that it's Jack Nicholson wanting to kind of disappear from reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because what he does is as he's switching the passport photos, we have just this brilliant bit of editing where we see that flashback, where we see we hear the audio,
an in-camera, in-shot flashback.
It's really fantastic. Like it's hard to even describe how they pull it off. It's not like technologically amazing or anything, but it's just you just don't see movies do things like this that often. Where we hear the conversation taking place, we see a tape recorder going, but then it pans across the room as Jack Nicholson is like hunched over the passport photos, and then we see that conversation in the same room take place from days earlier. So it's this real fantastic bit of cinema there. And so then what happens is that Jack Nicholson, having convinced the world, as it turns out, because the news spreads eventually that he's dead, is like, okay, I'm this guy now. What am I gonna do? And so he looks in Robertson, the dearly departed Robertson, looks inside of his like schedule or daily planner or whatever, and says, "Oh, looks like I've got to be in Munich at this time in this place. Why not? Let's go for it." Heads to Munich,
and then he gets a fake mustache.
Yeah, gets it, which is hilarious because the first time I saw it, I thought he actually like grew a mustache. I thought several days had passed. Yeah. And so there's this hilarious scene where he's talking on the phone and is sort of itching it and then just takes off the mustache and sticks it on a light and leaves it there. So it's this fantastic bit of comedy. But yeah, so heads to Munich. And it's written in the passport or like on the planner or something, number 58. So it goes to open like this little safe that's in the airport somewhere and sees, oh, these are like weapon schematics. This is the war I was looking for that I couldn't find because I was shambling around the desert. Like I finally found it, and now I'm impersonating an arms dealer.
So maybe a bit more than he bargained for.
A little bit more than he bargained for, even more so than when he was like, wandering around the desert and stuff. And it leads to probably the funniest part in the movie, even more so than the mustache, which is where he's like, well, damn, all right, well, I guess I gotta go somewhere. So he's going like to clear his head or whatever. And it's that point we see that these two guys are following him from the airport. They go into a church and they're like, "Hey, Robertson, we were supposed to meet in the airport. What's the deal?" He's like, "Oh yeah, the airport."
Yeah.
I totally forgot. Like it's this, just seeing Jack Nicholson realize like, oh, not only am I like suddenly out of nowhere in the blink of an eye impersonating an arms dealer, I'm dealing those arms right now. So just seeing Jack Nicholson play it off is something so funny to watch. And
another great detail in that scene is at the very end when the African arms dealer guy says like, "Give my regards to like Betty or something." And Jack Nicholson's like, "Who?" And he's like, "Betty." And he's like, "Oh." And he just has this look on his face of like, "Oh yeah, that's probably like my wife or something."
Yeah. Or maybe like a code name for someone else as he finds out later. It's just this hilarious bit. I think the funniest part of that scene actually is at the very end. It's after he gives them the gun schematics, like giving no real thought to, I've just funded a war that I was ostensibly at the very least trying to stop. So there's that right there. But also they hand him an envelope and he's got a wad of cash now. So it's like this blessing and a curse at the same time. He looks at it and goes, Jesus Christ, remembers he's in a church and then goes, oh, sorry about that. Like looks up at Jesus, or what I assume to be like a statue of Jesus or something. It is like, my apologies,
and when the guy hands him the money, he's like, "Hey, do you want to like check that?" And he's just like, "No, I believe you. It looks right."
Yeah, because they don't know what the guy looks like. So for all they know, their arms dealer is just having a really weird day. So it's this wonderful bit of comedy that just works on a couple of different levels. I really like that. And so that's sort of what gets the movie going. And from there, we'll be a little bit more vague from now on. But it turns into sort of this cat and mouse game where, yes, Jack Nicholson wants to, like just abandon his former life, which he had no regard for whatsoever, as becomes more and more evident throughout the movie. Just had no passion for it whatsoever, was completely disenfranchised by it, whether that's taken place over time or whether it's just a sudden onset of, I have nothing really to contribute to this world. Whatever the case, couldn't give a damn anymore and just wants to go around the world with this wad of cash I've come into through bizarre circumstance and just sort of live it up which he does do a couple of times, but it's always followed closely by being chased by the authorities in the form of his coworkers. One of them worked with him at the TV station, and one of them was his wife. They want to track down Robertson, in air quotes, the guy that he's impersonating, to figure out, hey, what happened to my husband and my coworker on the last day of his life? We just want to know. And then they start to realize, why is he running from us? And it becomes more and more perilous as it goes along. Lots of comedy ensues, lots of tension ensues, a couple of really good car chases. Which contains...
Which you wouldn't expect in an Antonioni movie.
Not really. There are a lot of weird incidental bits of action in these three American movies, though. Like the stuff with the plane and the explosion in Zabriskie Point. There's a couple of bits of real suspense and tension and blow up. And this is no different, but it's a lot more forthright about it. And it has this moment which just makes me laugh out loud. Another hilarious moment where they do this thing where they're being chased by the cops. They get pulled over. It looks like they're about to give up, and then just as the cops get out of the car, they're like, let's go, and they drive away. Which, I'll be honest, I've thought about doing that when I got pulled over for no reason. A couple of times I've been like, what if I did the passenger thing where I just waited for the cop to get out of the car and just sped away? I know I would be chased down, but it would just be hilarious to be able to say that I did it. God damn it. That moment is really funny to me. But yeah, the whole movie becomes this escape, this attempt to flee from not only this identity that he's come to despise, but also just sort of responsibility in general. So in that way, it's almost like a wish fulfillment movie. We've all had that. We've all had those inclinations. What if I just drove away? What if I just abandoned everything? I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know I certainly have. And I've come close to doing it at certain points. I've got some wanderlust in my soul. And so I've certainly been tempted to do something kind of like it. And yeah, it really just sort of scratches that itch of what if I did it while also simultaneously realizing that there are legitimate real world consequences and ramifications to doing that. Not that I've ever wanted to impersonate an arms dealer, but if the opportunity ever came across my lap, it would not be an instant decision for me. I'd be like, well, maybe I could get away with it. Having seen The Passenger, I'll not do what Jack Nicholson does, and then I'll get away with it. So that's one small part of the movie. I've talked a lot. Andrew, I want to know what is something that spoke to you about The Passenger, because I know you were in love with it immediately, right?
Yeah, from the very first time I watched it, I loved this one. After Zabriskie Point, which I kind of felt was my personal breakthrough with Antonioni. And in this movie, I think you kind of touched on it there's kind of this universal feeling of wanting to just kind of run away from your problems that I think to one degree or another every person in their life has thought about at least once or twice, which I think differentiates it from some of his other films, which seem a lot more specifically tied to the milieu or the profession of the character, and Blow Up the Photographer. Just being bored kind of for no reason. I feel like with this one and Jack Nicholson's character, it's really easy to relate and identify with him, which I don't always feel the most connected to when it comes to Antonioni protagonists.
Yeah, you're not wrong. That's very interesting that you say that. And I was also thinking about this in relation with some of his other work, specifically Zabriskie Point, which we mentioned a lot, but they're quite similar when you think about it. They're both about these characters sort of having enough with whether their own lives or just the world around them, and they just sort of go off and just to see what the horizon holds, so to speak. But this movie, The Passenger, has has a much more doomed feeling to it. And I think that's not only because of just the very specific incidents
very
within
fatalistic.
It's very fatalistic, yeah, and both movies are, but in different ways. I feel like with The Passenger, you have sort of this incident with like the getting involved in actual world politics and stuff, and how you can't just what's the word I'm looking for? You can't just tap out of that, really. Not on a dime, at the very least. Like especially when you're already sort of entrenched in it. And I think it also, part of that has to do with the ages of the character. Jack Nicholson, not an old man in this by any means, but he's certainly older, like mid-30s, I want to say, something along that. The characters in Zabriskie Point are young. They're college students. They have the whole world ahead of them.
They're like 20.
They're not abandoning much to speak of. So I think it's very interesting to compare these two movies and see how they relate when it comes to that inclination to leave, you know? I thought that was very fascinating, and to see how they paralleled in that way. And
they're also, I think, both sneakily political movies, although not in the most obvious ways, just because he's Antonioni.
Yeah, what about the Passenger speaks to that? Because I thought the same thing as well.
Well, there's this interesting thread in Jack Nicholson's character where you kind of see older recordings of his work when he actually was a reporter. And there's this one scene where his wife is watching him interview who we're led to believe is like the dictator of Chad. And he's just asking him these very simple of questions, trying to be, we can tell, objective as he can be, not really trying to force the issue or anything, even though afterwards his wife says something to him like, why didn't you like try to say anything that would go against him or challenge his point of view? And Jack Nicholson's like, well, those are the rules of like objective reporting. So he kind of feels like, I think, trapped by his profession in that way. And then later, there's another scene where you see him interview a witch doctor, where he asks him a very Eurocentric and I would say condescending question when he's like, so I've heard that you've traveled to like France and a few other European countries, but now you've come back here. Do you feel that the local practices of the village are now like less advanced or civilized than what you've come to be used to? And the witch doctor has this really interesting response where he basically tells Locke that there are answers to all of the questions you have, but at the end of the day, the questions say more about you than I could tell you the answers to them. And then the witch doctor actually turns the camera around onto Locke and tries to like then become the interviewer, asking Locke questions, so there's more of a dialogue and it's not just like a one-way street, so to speak. And then we see, of course, Jack Nicholson a few seconds after that turns the camera off because he can't really take that, which I think kind of speaks to how his character can't really see outside of himself and his own biases, which I think kind of ends up being his downfall. Not to get all spoilery, but as we said, it's very fatalistic. He doesn't have
not the least
best ending.
It's not the least predictable ending ever, but yes, it doesn't work out that great. I think that's fair to say. I think that's fascinating that you bring that up. I was going to bring up the same scene, and the most ironic thing of it all, as you alluded to, is that it's clearly something Jack Nicholson needs to hear. He clearly does not have much regard for other cultures, or at the very least this specific culture that he's tasked to sort of document and stuff. It's something that he needs to hear, and he doesn't hear it. Like he's completely called out and just sort of says like, well, hell, but then gives no thought to it, because we see later in the movie still doesn't really care for others. There's a scene, and this is consistent throughout the entire thing, where there's a scene where like just as he's leaving the airport in Munich, it's this really fast moment, but I think it speaks a lot to just how kind of callous he is at heart, where he damn near runs down like a horse-drawn carriage, like to the point where the coachman is like, "Slow down there, Buster." And so that's just, it's this little detail that just speaks to how much this character has to learn and how little he's willing to learn it. I think that's it's kind of the scene that really unlocks the whole movie. I think there's we've talked about a lot before. I want to make sure we get to Maria Schneider, who plays this college student who he runs into in Barcelona, and sort of gets swept up into his irresponsible escapades just because of how exciting they are. And I really like what she brings to this movie, especially now knowing like, you know, what all was going on behind the scenes and stuff. And I want to know very specifically, it reminded me of one movie in particular. Maybe it's because I talked about it recently on this very show. Did you get a Breathless vibe from this character?
Yeah, actually I kind of did. And then especially with like the very last scene, when both Locke's wife and her are asked a question and they both respond different ways. Very similar to the ending of Breathless, with Gene Seberg trying to understand what the French policeman is telling her.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of that. The whole movie kind of reminded me of Breathless, and I would be very surprised if that was not some sort of an influence on this movie, conscious or otherwise, especially given just how influential that movie was 15 years earlier. And
it also kind of sets up a contrast between their two characters, I think, because once Locke has stopped trying to make these appointments and kind of is just trying to live out his fantasy as this other person in Barcelona, but then, of course, everyone starts looking for him. That's at the point where he finds Maria Schneider's character. And from there, it's kind of this weird, interesting thing where he doesn't really want to keep making the appointments that Robertson was supposed to be keeping, but Maria Schneider kind of encourages him to do that, because there's this other scene where I think she says something to the effect of Robertson believed in what he was doing, which I think is also a very sly critique at Locke, and how before, when he was a reporter, he didn't really have any passion for the work that he was doing. He was just kind of going about it without really considering how his work could impact the people that he was making these documentaries on.
Yeah, that's very fascinating that you say that. There's this confrontational element to a character, which I think Jack Nicholson is clearly trying to just shrug off, but also I feel like he kind of knows that she's right, but is just trying to keeps trying to deny it. To the point where, when the movie ultimately reaches its conclusion, which we've alluded to several times, there's this matter of factness about it that the other two characters, Maria Schneider, who doesn't get a name if memory serves, and his wife.
She's just credited as girl in the credits.
Yeah, which weirdly enough is exactly the same thing with Rebecca, the lead character played by Joan Fontaine, doesn't get a name. It's like, it's not that hard, filmmakers. It makes it a lot easier to talk about the movies if you just give the characters a name. But also, it does somewhat serve a purpose in some strange way. I still think a name isn't too much to ask, but regardless, that's what we ended up with. but yeah, there's this frankness that these other two characters look at this entire situation with that I think is really indelible, and it leaves the movie on really melancholy note that is strange that it hits so hard, especially after all the strange conflicting, or not conflicting, that's the wrong words, but just sort of contrasting tones we've seen throughout it. Like it'll go from really suspenseful to really funny to just really sort of benign. Like there'll be entire sequences where they're just sort of like hanging out at a roadside cafe or like at this luxurious like country club looking thing in Barcelona, which is I gotta draw attention to the visuals here in this movie, which are really quite fantastic. I'm a sucker for landscape shots, and this movie's got tons of them.
Almost every single shot, the frame is just packed with something in the background, whether it's like natural landscape or architecture.
And even if it is architecture, it's really beautiful to look at. It's a lot of fascinating stuff in this movie. I am a really huge fan of it. I liked it even more the second time, and I expect that'll only continue to grow. Andrew, I know you were a huge fan of it to begin with. I want to know, is there anything about The Passenger that we haven't touched on yet? Because I feel like we got to a lot, but by all means, if there's anything.
I think we covered most of the movie without delving into spoilers. One thing I did want to bring up briefly, though, is that the original title of this movie, at least in Europe, is actually Profession Reporter. Which I think is an interesting title. I do like the Passenger title because that's it goes more metaphorical, but the Professione Reporter one is interesting, I think, because I think it kind of speaks to how Antonioni sees himself as a filmmaker. He sees himself as a reporter, I think, more than anything. But I think he differs from the David Locke character in that David Locke really can't see anything from his like own subjective point of view, and he's stuck in trying to be an objective journalist in a world that's completely non-objective. I think Antonioni, on the other hand, really is able to imbue his films with a certain philosophical point of view that reflects his worldview. And I think that's where Antonioni, of course, started his career more, I think, with in line with the neo-realist school of thought that was coming out of Italy. But he obviously departed and kind of created his own more, I'd say, symbolic, metaphorical style. And Antonioni, I found this quote about him talking about his films, which I thought is kind of really a perfect way to sum them up, which is, he said, "My work is like digging. It's archaeological research among the arid materials of our times. That's how I understand my first films, and that's what I'm still doing." And that's from an Esquire interview in 1970.
Wow.
So, and I think that the very end of this movie, you do kind of get the sense that Antonioni is diverging from Locke's point of view on all that has happened in the movie. And he's not really giving in to what Locke has kind of doomed himself to resign in by not using, or I'm sorry, by moving the camera away from him and kind of getting a look at all of the other things going on, which is a motif that recurs obviously throughout his films. You'll see in one of his movies where he'll be following a character and then something else will come in the way and his camera will just kind of go off and follow that other thing and then re-land on the character. So it's kind of this interesting thing of, he's really interested in people, I think, but he's also maybe just as, if not more, interested in the surroundings of the natural landscapes, obviously, but also just like the architecture. So I just think he has a really interesting point of view to offer that I haven't seen in a lot of other filmmakers' work.
You are so right. That is a lot of fascinating stuff you brought up there. I love what you said about the way he's fascinated with people. I would take it one step further. I would say he's more fascinated with how people navigate the world around them, which I know is kind of a vague, generic thing to say. But this really like kind of clicked in my mind when I watched Red Desert this morning, which is again about sort of just the crazy, what's the word I'm looking for? Just surge in industrialization in the past, couple of centuries, and maybe even less than that. It's because it got me to thinking. It's kind of like this what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of like this cultural whiplash. You know what I'm saying? Like you read history from like centuries ago, where it took thousands and thousands of years just to get from bronze to like iron. You know what I'm saying? And so just since like the 18th century, the insane advances in technology has got to be like evolutionary, existentially troubling to a lot of people. We see that a lot, where some people take to all this change so easily, and some people just cannot find their way in it whatsoever. And I think that's something that Antonioni was very keyed into. I mean, you even look at like technology from the year 1999 when I was born. It looks like cavemen stuff by today's standards. So
right.
It's crazy to think the exponential way that humanity has evolved in the grand scheme of things, at the very least. So that's a lot of fascinating stuff. I would love nothing more than just to talk about Antonioni and this movie scene by scene for hours. But there are a lot of fascinating things to be found in this movie. And I think the one thing I would like to leave this conversation at is that as much as we've sort of given like a really kind of broad overview of Michelangelo's career, I would say do not be afraid to start with The Passenger. Would you say that's a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I would actually, of the ones that I've seen, I would say The Passenger might just be the best one to start with. Because like I said, I started with Blow Up. But personally, I did find Blow Up to be pretty alienating, just because its main character, as you alluded to, is kind of just like this not very good person who doesn't really have a lot going on. Jack Nicholson, not that his character in The Passenger is that much better of a person necessarily, but I feel like Jack Nicholson, just as a movie star and as a presence, is able to kind of ground that character in this very universal emotion that's easy to identify with and relate to.
And it helps that it takes place in a little bit more of a recognizable milieu. Again, stuff like Blow Up, it's such a strangely conceived and presented movie. And the earlier stuff, before Antonioni transitioned to color, that's way more like avant-garde and stuff. And if you're into that, then I have no reason to doubt that you'll probably dig it. But stuff like Zabriskie Point and The Passenger, and I'd even throw Red Desert in there, that's a lot more recognizable as sort of that 60s transitioning into the 70s existential minefield kind of stuff. Your Easy Riders, again, your 5 Easy Pieces, to go back to Jack Nicholson. Lots of really great movies like that. I'm glad that we got to talk about a good few of them today. And I'm really glad we got to talk about The Passenger. So I think if that is everything, then we can move on to our B feature. What do you say?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. So as stated in the beginning of the show, and most likely in the title of the episode you're listening to, no reason to belabor it, it is Michael Powell's Peeping Tom.
Look out! Look out! Look out! Take care. You are being watched. We repeat, take care, for you are now alone with a killer. We warn you, don't let him see the fear in your eyes. For this is what he seeks, and this is why he kills.
Where are you? Where are you?
out for Carl Byrne as the Peeping Tom. Fear him, but pity him also.
It's no good.
Watch out for Moira Shearer as the lovely stand-in who innocently dances into danger.
Imagine someone coming towards you who wants to kill you, regardless of consequences.
A madman?
Yes.
Wait!
Anna Massey is the girl who falls victim to the charms of the lonely stranger upstairs.
Switch it off, Mark! Mark, switch it off!
Maxine Audley as the blind woman who senses the danger that threatens her and her daughter, but is helpless.
Don't be frightened.
Not frightened. Hot. So put that camera away!
There is no future for anyone who tries to befriend him. He invades the privacy of innocent people till the piercing eyes of his camera meet the terrified eyes of his victims. And with a compulsion akin to madness, he shoots the final, fearful scene.
Andrew, I want to ask you right off the bat, what is your familiarity with writer-director Michael Powell?
Michael Powell, I'm actually not that familiar with. I, of course, know of him because in the 40s and 50s, he made what are considered to be probably some of the best British films from that period with his filmmaking partner, Pressburger, whose first name I unfortunately don't know.
It's Emmerich Pressburger.
Emmerich Pressburger, yeah. I've heard great things about all those movies. They've been on my watch list forever. I just have never gotten around to them. But judging by Peeping Tom, I would say I'm probably in store for a really good time with most of his other work.
You know, it's strange that you say that because I am not an expert by any means, but I have seen a small handful of Powell and Pressburger's movies. I have seen... what have I seen? I've seen The Red Shoes, which is quite good. What else? Oh, what was the other one? I've seen A Canterbury Tale, which I don't particularly remember, but I remember it being good. And I've seen Stairway to Heaven, aka A Matter of Life and Death, which is really fantastic. But none of those have like anything especially notable in common with Peeping Tom. Now, part of that potentially is because Peeping Tom was a solo venture for Michael Powell. The only real similarities I can spot are not in the subject matter, but more just in sort of a general aesthetic of it. It looks the same as a lot of those other movies I've seen. But yeah, some of the other ones that I've yet to get to are... what's it called? The one in the convent.
Black Narcissus.
That's the one. Yes. I couldn't remember in the title. I just kept thinking the word convent. I'm like, that can't be it. That can't be the title of the movie. Yeah. Black Narcissus. And there's another one. Oh yeah. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp and 47th Parallel, various other ones. They had quite a long and successful career. Which is a shame when I learned that Peeping Tom sort of functionally torpedoed Michael Powell's career and by extension, Emmerich Pressburger's, which is even a bigger shame because I'm just going to jump right to it. Peeping Tom is kind of awesome.
Oh yeah, I would say it's probably up there with Psycho as far as 1960 horror thriller movies go that have been extremely influential.
There was that, there was Psycho, and there was Eyes Without a Face, which I also talked about with Jason Reed. All three released in 1960. What a year to be a blossoming horror fan. I can only imagine. So again, to give a little context on this one, Peeping Tom was written by writer Leo Marx, who sort of cited this movie as sort of an amalgamation of a lot of experiences that he had across his life. Everything from like neighborhoods that he had been in witness of to like, you know, scientific discoveries that he had read about. Lots of stuff like that was sort of compiled together into this story about for lack of a better word, a serial killer, a murderer, a violator of the fifth commandment, however you want to say it. That was this guy's deal. It is about to set the stage. It is about a photographer who works at a bookstore who moonlights as like a technician on a film set. Played by, I got the name right here, played by Karl-Heinz Bohm, a German actor. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. First thing we see in the movie is what is very clearly like a camera being turned on. We're seeing through the lens of the camera as it goes up to a woman on the street who turns out to be a prostitute, follows her back to her apartment, and then through some means that we don't see at first, she's killed. And we see the investigation going on the next day, and the same guy who committed the murders, who we see later on that night, rewatching back the footage. So really striking way to beginning, is sort of masquerading as a reporter. Like someone says, "Hey, what are you doing here?" "Oh, I'm taking pictures for the murder that happened." Yeah.
And he asks him, like, what newspaper or magazine are you from? And he says something where I feel like he's just making up some name on the spot.
It's especially funny. The name he comes up with, very fitting, The Observer. Very fitting. Just a vague newspaper name that also happens to sort of be to sort of tie into a lot of what this movie is getting at. It's kind of, this is what I was alluding to earlier when I said I was going to bring up Maniac. That's the movie this reminded me of a lot, where it's just sort of taking you to the inside the mind of a killer and leaving you there by yourself, abandoning you in this desolate landscape, and just like this full bore experience of what does this person go through on a daily basis. Now, the tone is very different, obviously. Although it would be fascinating, double feature with Maniac.
Yeah. One trash classic and one more, a little classier, I would say.
I would say so as well. Yes, it's certainly got an air of class to it, even though there's a lot of stuff that this movie really had a lot of trouble getting past the censors, to the point where I found this fascinating. It was released in April of 1960 and got pulled from theaters after 5 days because there was such an uproarious response to all the graphic content in this movie. And I'm watching it, and I'm thinking,
there's no graphic content.
Not especially, at least not by today's standards. Like nothing, I wouldn't say any of it is worse than anything like in Psycho or anything. I think Eyes Without a Face is more gruesome than this by a long shot.
It's just all suggested.
It's suggestive, and granted, it's very suggestive if you've seen a lot of other things from the time, which is the production code is still going on. Granted, it was a little bit different over in England, but there was still something of a guideline for this kind of thing. It got more lenient as time goes on. Like you would never see anything even remotely like this in the 30s or 40s or even the 50s. But even still, I'm watching this, I'm thinking, obviously this is more suggestive than most for the time. If this movie came out today, like exactly as it is, just with, updated technology or whatever, no one would give it a second thought. Like it would just be,
it would just feel tame.
It wouldn't feel like a big deal. It would feel tame if someone was getting really upset about it. But there might be like a few articles about how protesters throw rocks at the screen or something like that. That's a random story that Louis Spoonwell told about in Chien Andalou. We are a lot of deep cuts in this episode. I hope our listeners enjoy it. But yeah, so getting back to the plot of the movie, that is basically what we see is this killer's modus operandi. And as we find out, he is not an especially what's the word I'm looking for? Not especially evocative of a serial killer. This man, you know what I'm saying? Like he's just he's kind of shy, he's kind of timid, but you wouldn't assume at first that like this man is a cold-blooded killer or anything like that. So that's
he just seems like a socially awkward guy who's just kind of a loner.
Yeah. Which, I mean, listen, that's certainly there are a lot of stories to be told about that. And this reminded me very specifically of a movie that I just happened to watch recently, which I'll get to in a minute. But yeah, I want to know, Andrew, getting a little bit more specific, what is your connection to this movie, which I had not seen before today? So I have no real story to go along with it. Yeah, I just finished it a few hours ago, so I'm coming off of this pretty fresh, but I understand that you have a bit more of a storied connection with it.
Yeah, so I think if I remember right, I learned about this movie, weirdly enough, in actually a film class on 1970s New Hollywood cinema.
Really?
Because I think, we did at The Exorcist for like an entire week. And if I remember correctly, we had to do a reading on specifically Peeping Tom, just to try to understand how important Peeping Tom was to the development of horror, at least modern horror, kind of from like 1960 onward. But we actually didn't watch the film in that class, kind of understandably, because that was for New Hollywood. Obviously, Peeping Tom isn't a New Hollywood film. But I remember learning about it then, and then I think right toward the end of when I was about to graduate, I think like my last semester, I gave it a watch one night just for fun. And actually, the first time I watched it, I think I was just in a bad mood or something, because I remember really not being that into it. I appreciated all of like the technical stuff, and thematically, I pretty much got everything it was trying to get across. It was just like from a plot/story point of view, it didn't really do it for me that first time. But I think I was just like in a bad mood or something, because I rewatched it like about a year ago, I want to say, and I completely was like, it was like watching the movie for the first time again. And I was like, okay, I can understand why a lot of people consider this to be one of the first modern masterpieces of horror.
Yeah, it really is a progenitor of a lot of things. That's fascinating that it was paired with The Exorcist, though. That is not. I would assume maybe Halloween. Like that would be one of the movies that I would think you could see a lot of the DNA for stuff like Halloween in this movie. A lot of the giallo,
lots of slasher stuff.
Lots of slasher stuff. A lot of giallo influences in here.
Definitely.
Which I also, just bringing up that episode again, I got to talk about Deep Red with Jason Reed a few weeks ago, so that was a lot of fun. And yeah, I could getting to go back and see this before, I was like, oh wow, so it goes back even further than that, which obviously I knew, but I just had never seen it with my own eyes. So that was really fascinating to see. Specifically, I think Halloween owes a huge debt in that it opens with like that POV shot, that's exactly like John Carpenter's Halloween. Lots of
as far as I know, I have not seen a film earlier than Peeping Tom that uses a point of view shot like behind the camera like the way it does.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there are any others. I'm sure someone did it, but not nearly as notably as this, I would assume. Yeah, maybe it's out there, but we don't know. But regardless, it was. So the movie came out 1960, and again had a mixed reaction at best. A lot of critics were just really harsh to it. Someone said it belonged in like a sewer, and that it should just be disposed of and forgotten about completely. And the tide had turned as early as the 1970s. So just yet another example of how time is the only real critic that matters. It wasn't until the late 70s when Martin Scorsese, you may have heard of him, happened upon the movie via a friend who had somehow gotten a hold of a copy, which had been largely banned or excommunicated from all sources of history and stuff, and sort of went out of his way to really boost the popularity. So thanks for that, Marty. Like, no kidding. That was really something quite good you did there. Martin Scorsese has always been a huge proponent of letting the world see movies that it might not have seen otherwise. So I'm always thankful for that. And yeah, it's this really unusually told by modern standards. I think is fair to say. Just sort of journey of seeing this character, like just sort of what he does on a daily basis, and how there's this one time that it's different. Again, it's Mark Lewis is the character's name. The photographer lives in like the penthouse of a building that belonged to his father.
He's just renting it to people.
He's renting it under the guise of also being a tenant, to the point where someone is like, "Oh, you live here too?" He's like, "No, I'm your landlord." So how about that?
And they're like, "Oh."
Yeah. He meets this woman who lives there. What's her name? Helen. Played by Anna Massey. And they strike up a relationship also, again, like Maniac, where they're sort of kind of out of the blue, they're starting to develop this like healthy relationship that just might be the thing that saves them. But there's always this air of impending tragedy around the whole thing, that something is just going to go horribly wrong. And yeah, we see multiple kills get taken place. The second one is where the movie really gets going, which is where they're in this recording studio, and Mark has convinced this stand-in on the set, this body double, essentially, Vivian, played by Moira Shearer from The Red Shoes. So a nice little connection there. Says like, "Hey, let's film something by ourselves tonight. Let's stay after they, shut off all the lights and everyone leaves." And they start doing this like little dance number or everything, but there's also this really ominous music going around, and it goes on, like it really ratchets up the suspense, because it's just that shoe is going to drop eventually, and it's going to go from potentially just something really exciting and youthful and energetic to something completely horrific. And it reminded me of those videos on YouTube that you see that are like so and so movie but edited in just such a way that it looks like a completely different genre, like Frozen as an action movie or something, just off the top of my head. Those videos?
Yeah, for sure.
I thought, like, I'll bet someone could take this scene of them just dancing and frolicking around in the soundstage late at night and make it seem like a really exciting romantic comedy instead of this really dreadful scene building up to a gruesome kill, in which eventually Mark decides, all right, I'm going to do it. Sets up this like trap for Vivian, essentially, and says, all right, now you stand here, and then unveils the murder weapon, which is the front leg of the tripod fully extended outwards, which is hiding a knife. There's a hidden knife in the tripod pointing directly outward. Now, you don't have to be Sigmund Freud to understand the metaphor going on there, where it's literally like they're not even shy about it. It's really obvious that it's as if the camera literally has an erection, like it's this huge phallic thing that's being used, because he only kills women. So that is certainly not something to be ignored. It reminded me a lot of this movie I watched recently on the Criterion Channel that I had never heard of before, called The Sniper, which is about a character very much like the lead character we see in Peeping Tom, this sort of socially awkward character who is essentially was kind of one of the first examples that I can think of, at least, of like the for lack of a better word, of the incel archetype, which just for whatever reason feels utterly inferior and doomed romantically and stuff like that. And so this guy's gotten a hold of a gun and just assassinates women from rooftops and feels great remorse about it. Like is writing notes to the police like, stop me now. And yet is a monster through and through. And it's just this movie of trying to figure out, what do we do? What can we do? It's a really fascinating movie, and it plays are possibly even more interestingly today than it did back in 1955. So it even predates Peeping Tom. So that's another double feature I'd love to do.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out.
It's really great. I can't imagine it's the easiest to find, but if you can track it down, the sniper deserves a resurgence, if I'm calling the shots. But yeah, it's a character you can kind of suss out like what the deal is with this character just from our description. Now, Andrew, I want to know, what is it again about this movie that really compelled you, especially that second time around?
Actually, the second time I found myself actually sympathizing with him a lot more, as weird as that may seem to sound, because while he is going around and doing these horrible things, he also comes from this traumatic past, which he reveals in this one scene pretty early on when Helen comes up to his room where he's got all his camera equipment and projector and stuff, and he puts on an old film of him from when he was a kid, at which point we learn that his father was some kind of scientist guy who was obsessed with the idea of fear and figuring out what provokes fear and how the person feeling fear it relates to that. So we see him as Mark as a kid, and his father is just doing some really mean things, like putting a lizard on his bed in the middle of the night.
Yeah, that gave me that really gave me the willies. Like, I have a fear of just creatures, and so seeing that lizard just like wriggling around and stuff, it's really terrifying. So you could see how to a kid that would be really traumatizing, and God knows what else was going on when the camera wasn't on. You know?
Yeah, and then you see like his father has him come like put his hand by like his dead mother, where we're led to assume she's dead at that point. So it gets really dark. And the Mark character, he is obviously dealing with this kind of childhood trauma that it seems like has stunted his development when it comes to interacting just normally with people. And I think that's kind of led to this weird, perverted sexual pleasure he gets out of filming other people while they're dying, which is why the title is called Peeping Tom, because he's obviously recording them through his camera as he's killing them, which just makes it that much more darker. And I think the reason why this movie, when it first came out, was so universally reviled by critics was because they didn't want to see how much they could actually see of themselves in Mark Lewis, either as like film critics who watch films a lot, or just as like fellow filmmakers who, whether you want to admit it or not, there is a sort of perverse visual pleasure that goes along with being someone who's an avid watcher of films.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think you're getting into the real meat of this movie. I think I want to touch on one thing you said real fast, which is very interesting word choice that you used just now of the sexual thrill he gets. See, I didn't necessarily get a thrill. I got it almost like this penance that sort of like he just feels compelled to do it, you know?
Okay. As
if he has no other choice, you know what I'm saying? Like I never got this idea that he was like, you know, cackling maniacally like, "Yes, I've done it again." There's clearly at least somewhat of an inkling of remorse. You know what I'm saying? Now, not that it makes it forgivable. It's still murder, of course, and very manipulative murder at that.
Yeah, in a way, it kind of makes it creepier just because of how detached he is while he's doing it, which obviously kind of speaks to how filmmakers are kind of by nature have to be sort of detached from whatever they are filming. to a certain extent. Hopefully you're not going around doing what Mark Lewis is doing.
I hope not. My goodness, yes. Yeah, that would be an object of concern, I would say. But yeah, that is something that's really kind of lingering under the surface, is which is unusual, because at least to my knowledge, that's not really like a auteuristic theme throughout Michael Powell's earlier work. But maybe that was Pressburger reining him in. So who knows? Maybe
yeah,
maybe Michael Powell has a lot of very interesting ideas. And yeah, it is very confrontational about the way that movies sort of obfuscate reality in a way that's designed to entertain. And it's not like there's anything especially demonic about that. Like, I want to make that clear. It's not. Yeah,
we're not saying that we're all evil for watching movies.
And I don't think the movie is either. But I think there is this very clear sort of, what's the word, objection, or maybe just an attempt to point out how, like, this is all like really fake and stuff. And I think there's maybe that can get, like, it can get a little out of hand sometimes, especially with this maniacal obsession. Like, one of the things we see Mark doing throughout the movie is just sort of rewatching the stuffy films as if through some great, like, compelling, like some godly compulsion that he feels to just relive it for all of its horror. And there's something just so fascinating about that. And I of course I loved it the first time, but I just wish I had had more time to reflect further on it. I want to know, I have a few other things, but is there anything else? Cause I feel like we kind of got to some good stuff, and we're not going to give away the ending to this one, I don't think, but is there anything else that you wanted to make note about in Peeping Tom?
I would just say also, I think it is an interesting layer to Mark's character, that he feels the need to have to film the people while he's doing this. And then he obviously always has those films now of his victims forever, which he can also obsessively rewatch like he does his old home videos. I think it kind of gets to the idea of trying to find, even if it's like a really wrong way to go about it, trying to find some type of like common shared pain between him and other people, which I think is part of what psychologically is driving him to do these things, even if he's not consciously aware of it, which just kind of adds another interesting layer to his character, and makes you kind of reflect more on how he's probably not a terrible person at heart. He just doesn't know how to deal with these things from when he was abused by his father as a kid. So it actually ends up kind of being tragic by the end.
Yeah, it is a real tragic story when it's all said and done. And that was something I was very surprised by. I was not expecting it to be that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something that really differentiates it from a lot of the movies that it inspired even. So that was really fascinating to see. One thing I did find somewhat amusing is that he has this big, like, 8mm camera. It was 1960. They didn't have like the little camcorders and stuff that we have now. So having to, like, the idea that he's able to somehow hide it, like, in a big overcoat, which, granted, it's a huge coat. You could probably hide some stuff under there, but even still, it's this huge bulky thing that a lot of people, just as we see those POV shots, don't really notice at first, and especially with the tripod and everything. I just found that amusing, and I would like to see the act of actually concealing the camera itself. Because now you think about it, you could just slip like a smartphone into your shirt pocket and no one thinks twice about it. So that was somewhat amusing, but I'm perfectly willing to suspend my disbelief on that one.
Yeah, and I think the movie even kind of acknowledges that at one point when he's about to go on a date with Helen, and right before they leave, she says, like, when's the last time you went out without carrying your around the camera.
Yeah.
And he's like, I can't remember.
And I think, and it's a sign of great trust that she actually convinces him, like, why don't you just leave it here? And he's like, you know what? I will.
Yeah.
I will do that. So that was, I thought that was a good moment to throw in there. And yeah, it's this fascinating character. There are a lot of things to touch on with this movie. Of course, we're only just scratching the surface as always, but there are a lot of really great analyses of this movie, and the way that it just sort of takes the what's the word, the practice, the art form, so to speak, of cinema, and takes it to sort of an irrational extreme, and just shows like, yeah, this art form is great and helpful and everything, and creates lots of jobs and provides lots of artistic opportunity, but also there's a lot.
It can lead you down a dark path.
There's a lot sort of lingering under
careful.
the surface. Exactly. Yeah. There can be a lot of evil, and I think this movie just goes full bore. Like, what would that evil look like? Someone who just does anything they can at all to seek some sort of comfort within this strange practice we've all gotten so used to at the time. And this is it reminded me of another movie. It reminded me of was Breathless again, which I keep bringing up. Just the way that it also is sort of really openly acknowledging the existence of film as an art form. Now, it's not as like idiosyncratic as Breathless or anything. It's not acknowledging specific works within the art form, but just sort of the idea of it. It wasn't something you saw acknowledge all the time before that. So I can see, while I do watch it and say like, okay, it's not that extreme by today's standards, I can see how sort of the confrontational aspect of it all might have been a little off-putting to some.
Yeah, a
little hard to swallow, perhaps. It could have been a variety of things, but I think it's good that we get to enjoy it now. And indeed, it has become quite a classic over the years. So it just goes to show once again that anything is possible with the miracle of time.
Yeah, I would say by today's standards, it's not really a scary movie. But yeah, like you alluded to, there is a lot going on that you can pick up in the subtext that makes it far more disturbing than I think maybe even Michael Powell was even aware of while he was making it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wish I'd looked up some interviews about it before, but yeah, no, Michael Powell was from what I was able to gather, was very resentful that this movie got the reaction that it did, and was especially critical of kind of how hypocritical that all turned out to be, even just a decade later, saying like, oh, it's the most repulsive thing in the 60s and it's the 70s, it's fantastic. So I can definitely see where that resentment would have come from. So it's a damn
probably
shame.
Just one of those cases where it was a movie that was just too ahead of its time, unfortunately for it.
Yeah, there are some movies like that. I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. A movie too ahead of its time. That is Peeping Tom.
The public just wasn't ready for it.
They just weren't ready for the glory, the greatness, and the truth of Peeping Tom. I think that's as good a place as any to leave off. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I had a wonderful time, and I hope you had as much fun as I did.
Oh yeah, definitely. Had a great time on here. Thank you very much for having me. And if you ever want to bring me back, I'd always be up for that.
I'd absolutely love to. Is there anything that you want to plug besides your Letterboxd account, which we'll have linked in the show notes?
No, I don't have anything to plug. If you're on Letterboxd and want to follow me, feel free to do so. If not, that's totally fine too.
Yeah, and I cannot encourage this enough. I love reading Andrew's reviews. He's always watching something interesting. I really dig it a lot. And of course, I'm on there as well. Sam. Of course, yes. You're a very knowledgeable fellow, and so I like to. Even when I vehemently disagree, which happens more often than you would think. I'm always a fan. So that is a good place to find what Andrew's up to. And of course, I'm always on Letterboxd. And I think that just about does it for our show. And so we will sign off from a lonely hotel room in Barcelona. I am Sam.
And I'm Andrew.
And we'll see you next time.